Good morning, I'm Daniela Polese. I'm psychiatrist and psychotherapist, both individual and group psychotherapist. I have worked for several years on clinical aspects of psychosis, depression, and personality disorders in young adults and adults. Then I moved to adolescents, and then I thought that was very important going deep into the physiology of the mind. And so I switched to adolescents and family with children. I am working in the context of a PhD program on sensory neural plasticity, specifically on developmental neuroscience and mind physiology of University Sapienza of Rome. And I am focusing on neuroplasticity and sensory organs in newborns and during the first year of life. I will speak about the brain activation and mind activity before first breath at human birth. Let's ask, when does brain functioning start? And when does human thinking begin? Developmental neuroscience research has still not uncovered a few dynamics of human birth. That which triggers the first breath is still poorly understood, nor has brain modification at birth being clarified. So my paper is focused on research on brain activation at birth before first breath, aiming at understanding the original physiology of human mind, as I was saying before. Several studies show how pivotal physiological events take place before first breath. Although several different neonatologists admit that they have never thought that the beginning of a human life is linked to first breath, this tenet remains very popular. For instance, more than 60 years ago, on The Lancet, the medical community interrogated itself about this theme, concluding that the first breath of a newborn infant marks the climax of a dramatic physiological upheaval, but the precise sequence of events is still far from clear. Nowadays, it seems that no significant progresses in any direction have been made. The mechanisms that are at the basis of the beginning of human life are expected to be multifactorial and still not well characterized. As a consequence, the region or structures of the brain that are needed for regular brain functioning at birth have still not been identified, even though brain inactivity is widely accepted and acknowledged as the operative condition to decide life end. WHO guidelines consider that rather than immediately at birth, first breath can physiologically occur up to 60 seconds after birth. This delay varies interindividually, averaging to about 20 seconds, and has been well documented by several reports. During this time, baby is unmoved. Its muscles are flexed. So what's happening? This observation entails two different alternatives. Either the newborn is not actually alive in the first few seconds of extrauterine existence and the brain is in pause, or human life begins with something else. Something else can be unidentified, unidentified, exactly, brain movement that is involved into the initial stimulation of the complex cascade that precedes and leads to first breath. For example, as you see in the slide, this is a paper that we have published this year, and it is an open access for people who are interested on it. It is aimed at opening a debate about this topic on human birth. First respiratory action must necessarily be preceded by the clearance of the fluid from the lungs. The adrenaline-mediated activation of sodium channels on the apical pulmonary surface stops the secretion of the fluid and initiates its reabsorption. Clearance process happens simultaneously with labor, with uterine contractions that causes fetal chest wall to change, thereby driving the fluid outside the lungs. Approaching term, the release of pulmonary surfactant by alveolar cells lowers air to liquid interfacial tension, thereby facilitating the expansion of the lungs. All these steps start before respiratory action and make it possible. However, in order to take place, first breath needs active contraction of the diaphragm. And that's how the gap is clarified. As we know, the diaphragm contracts and flattens and the chest cavity enlarges. This contraction creates a vacuum which pulls air into the lungs. Thus, it is the diaphragm to cause an expansion of a thoracic cage, a dilation of intrathoracic trachea, and the movement of air into the lungs. But how this contraction happened at birth? Diaphragm contraction is controlled by multiple factors and stimuli, all originating in diverse areas of the central nervous system, and involves many afferent and efferent neural sensitive volitional arcs and biochemical inputs, as well as motor outputs to respiratory muscles, facial structures, and airway effectors. All these signals are integrated, modulated, and transmitted to effector organs by brain. This explains why brain death is associated with the abrogation of autonomous breathing function. We have to connect the beginning of life and the end of life because they both have connection with brain activity. Recent clinical studies have shown that at birth, abrupt activation of the coliac fuse nucleus in the pon take place and initiate the first inspiratory action. Coliac fuse drastically changes its function from the passage from fetal condition to human birth, and it gives rise to the first respiratory action. This happens via direct stimulation of the facial parafacial complex in the caudal pons, that in turn activates the Prebodzinger nucleus in the medulla oblongata, which is the actual activator of the diaphragm. Here we can see on the right, behind me, the right, a brainstem schematic representation showing the localization of respiratory network. At the end, there's the medulla oblongata with the pre-Bodzinger nucleus. Moreover, in the passage from intrauterine condition to extrauterine life, boosts of stimuli come from the new natural environment. Capability to react to sensory stimuli is the feature that consents viability and is the base of newborn vitality, which is measured by the APGAR score at birth. We have light, cold, and rumors, and the acoustic bombardment that we have. This here you can see how all these aspects are which compone the APGAR score are connected to the capability to react to new environment, and they measure newborn vitality. It's about the heart, skin, muscles, and respiratory action. At around 24th gestational week, indeed, neural connections between sensory organs, thalamus, and the cortex and the neocortex have been formed through the subplate neurons, and the fetus become able to react to stimuli and consequently viable. The reactivity to external stimuli after birth has been also shown by newborn behavior since the first days of life, as assessed by the neonatal behavioral assessment scale by Dr. Barry Brazelton. First version is 1973 and the last version is 2011 with Dr. Nugent. And this scale has shown how the early intersubjectivity is absolutely visible after birth, from first month of life. We propose that the central nervous system, reacting to stimuli from the new extrauterine environment, plays a crucial role on the first breath and the beginning of life. And this can make us understanding more and more about the physiology of mind before the contact with the breast. For instance, a specific stimulus from the new environment can trigger brain activation, which in turn starts the neuromuscular activity, determining the diaphragm contraction and first breath. This immediate reaction of the newborn brain to the new environment precedes and leads to the physiological responses and characterizes the beginning of CNS activity. We must consider that the main activity in the human brain consists on mind functioning. If we understand that before first breath, a brain activation occurs in response to external stimuli from natural environment, we have to consider that during that time of few seconds before the first breath, a brain activation can occur together with mind functioning and mind response to external stimuli. Having in mind the recent studies on newborn behavior, the CNS activation at birth can consist of brain activation and consequently mind functioning, which could be considered the beginning of human thinking at the beginning of life. A hypothesis about the beginning of human thinking at birth has been formulated by the Italian psychiatrist and psychotherapist Massimo Fagioli in his human birth theory. For instance, Fagioli has theorized that the newborn brain and mind react to light, realizing a fantasy at human birth. Fagioli's theorizes about the content of this human thinking, and we report it here because it's connected to our research. Thanks to the physiological capability to react and vitality that the newborn has at birth, the newborn makes the world around him or her disappearing, reacting to light, as it does not exist. And at the same time, in defense from this new environment full of stimuli, the mind of newborn, according to Fagioli's theory, creates in his mind an image having the sensitive trace on the skin of the contact had with the amniotic fluid, which is still there on the skin. And this is the human requirement, this dynamics of the mind, is the human requirement which consents the active search of the breast, maybe after some sleeping after birth. And this consent the early intersubjectivity discovered in the last decades. Thus, capability to react and capability to imagine can be considered as the main features of human nature since birth, and they can be connected to brain activation, which occurs during the passage to extrauterine environment. Here we suggest new research into neurophysiological processes that occur at human birth, and to initiate further investigation on psychological physiology in newborn, considering the relationship between brain and mind. Finally, this research can lead to further investigation also on pathophysiology in psychiatry, starting from physiology of the mind. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your attention.